to launch James Hereward's book. James Hereward is not his real surname, and it is as some of the people who are involved in history here know, I tirelessly spend my life trying to connect Celbridge and North Kildare with every famous historical character. It's not generally well known that Napoleon's horse Marengo used to great. I made that up. But the reality is that we have, when you move into this realm of speculative fiction, it opens up all sorts of avenues for a writer and for a journalist, for what James is doing, that wouldn't be available in the prison of the more realistic fiction that we are all used to and we grew up and we learned in school. And this is something that isn't celebrated enough, and I hope tonight that we will be able to celebrate. I don't know what it would be like to have been at the launch of Stephen King's first book or Tolkien's first book, or but I hope it would be an occasion like this where people, friends gathering, wondering and speculating about speculative fiction, that this might be a big breakthrough novel. And I do, having read it, feel that we have some immense talent here. Talent doesn't win in literature or film or anything like that. A lot depends on other external factors, luck being important, timing being important. But I do think that it's a good start that he picked a journalist as his protagonist. Yeah. I do think it's a good start that he picked a journalist as a protagonist on a day 2 journalists were awarded the Nobel Prize for doing something like his protagonist does, trying to prevent a war. That's a spoiler, hope I'm okay. And I do like the way that he captures the life of a journalist so well. By page 10, and I feel at home with this guy already, he's in the cells. By page 17, he's telling someone, we specialize in making people want to believe things enough that they don't care whether it's true. I'll also remind you that tonight is the 25th anniversary of Fox News. He also tells us on page 20 that journalists always need to stay interesting and to remain valuable. This is of more than passing interest because he's in danger of his life at this stage. He has been, as many journalists in my acquaintance, and on at least 2 occasions myself, were identified because we were asking questions as a spy. Once was in a Loyalist club in East Belfast, the other was an Inkatha club in apartheid South Africa, which was much more scary than the Loyalist club, but I can talk about that. And towards the end, nobody arrived to drag him out and shoot him, so he got up and dressed and returned to his writing, which is nice, grandiose, profound. But then the next line is, he tried, but no words would come. And that's the bit we all identify with. Even the bit where the protagonist gets kicked in the ribs, I could identify with that. It happened to me on one occasion, and again in Belfast, in East Belfast. And forever grateful to Samuel Wilson, who would be from the extreme wing of the DUP, for coming in the car to get me out of a group of shipyard workers who broke some of my ribs on that occasion. And there are the things that journalists do, and I've been a travel writer since 2002, but it brings back that tremendous sense of being in the heart of the action and the crackle of danger. You know, the bomb going off, I don't know if many of you have had a bomb go off, but it doesn't sound like the movies. There's sort of a crackle and a vacuum first, and then this dull thud, and you don't the whine of the plastic bullet, because you don't know where the plastic bullet's going to bounce. Is it going to take your eye out? Or the feeling that when you have a bag over your head, which happened to me on one occasion, and you're being disorientated to be brought to an interview. I agreed to this in advance. It was somebody who was on the run from and wanted to show me his collection of guns, machine guns and things like that. John Bingham it was his name. But that feeling when you're disorientated with a bag over your head, are they fooling, and will you actually get out of it alive? Very funny that, because I went to, I think it was Dan Feeney, who was an SDLP councillor in Belfast the following day, told him, he wanted to know what had happened, and I told him about, being brought away and everyone was disguised. He said, that's Johnny Bingham. So that Johnny Bingham, sadly deceased since. James chose speculative fiction. There's something, some people have said that fantasy, which is sort of the more populist word for it, but speculative fiction in Ireland aren't really into, we're not well known for our speculative fiction authors. And there is a long answer and a short answer to that. The short answer, which I'll give first, may be longer than the long answer, but that is that, yes, we have a huge connection with tremendous speculative fiction writers. Many of the children's round in recent years, Eoghan Corry, if that's not fantasy, what is? Sure. But we also have huge connections with the established big name, the marquee writers. There's no doubt that Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis would be speculative fiction central, and he was close friendship with Tolkien. There was all that sharing of vision and sharing of ideas, and they were both from a young age chasing their own particular imaginary worlds, largely because of the reality of what they were confronting for First World War, Ireland and Britain. And Tolkien, of course, was the external examiner for what is now NUI Galway in the 1940s. They did a great walking tour of Ireland in 1926, Tolkien and Lewis together. And Tolkien was external advisor for what is now NUI Galway in 1948, spent a lot of time in North Clare. And Paul the Gollum, which is off the N67, as you're heading just after it breaks with the coast going north from Ballyvaughan, about the fourth cross on the left over the fence and mind the sheep, and you'll come to this amazing cave, which is one of the longest in Ireland. And for anyone who can work out Tolkien's connection between Paul the Gollum and Lord of the Rings, there's a free glass of wine from the bar. Well, it's free anyway, but okay. And Terry Pratchett on the other side of Clare has talked, openly admitted that Biddy Early from Fecal was the model for the witches in his Discworld. Witch as nurse midwife would be the best way of summing it up. It's not a witch that you're afraid of that comes out in the end of this month. It's a witch that does good and has great theories on how the world should be run. And he actually donated a bottle of whiskey to somebody to pour over Biddy Early's grave, because as some of you will know, Biddy Early's grave is unmarked in Fecal, and he couldn't find it on his own visit, but the person, the Clare man, he gave the bottle of whiskey to, says, "Do you mind if it passes through me first?" Which brings us to James's surname. Hereward the Wake was sort of glamorized in the middle of the 19th century as an when Anglo-Saxon resistance to the Normans was being revisited and largely recreated. And the lives of Hereward the Wake, they itemize his time in Ireland when he had fled as an outlaw before his battles against William the Conqueror, and he became involved with what was now known as the son of the King of Ireland in a battle against the Duke of Munster, very easily traceable to Diarmaid Mac Mael who would be well known as the great-grandfather of Diarmaid Mac Murrough, King of Leinster, the man who transferred the seat of power of Leinster from the Hill of Lions, very close to us here, back down to Ferns in County Wexford. And he led an expedition into Munster to install Turullo Brian as the King of Munster, in which Hereward the Wake possibly took a part, very likely took a part, if those the literary sources which were used by Charles Kingsley to put together that book in the 19th century. It later became, some of you will be old enough to remember the 16-part series in BBC in the 1960s. It was based on that. All the tapes of that have been lost, by the way, which is a bit of a tragedy. But when Hereward the Wake went back to England, and Diarmaid Mac Mael not only facilitated Hereward the Wake, he also facilitated two sons of King Harold after the Battle of Hastings, lent his fleet to them if they were trying to win back their kingdom from William the Conqueror, and also gave Harold's battle standard to another king. But in around a few years after, when Hereward the Wake was fighting against the Normans as a resistance, the last bit of resistance to Norman conquest of England. In the 19th of October 1082, which isn't too far away in anniversaries, Diarmaid MacMénamoe and Turulach's sons participated in a battle. It's Uncle Wikipedia and anti-Google or will tell you that it was near Leinster, but it was actually the Commons in Charlottetown, which partly encroaches onto Killing's golf course, that people know down there. It's a lovely walk along the canal with your dog, and the little house opposite obviously is the childhood home of Charlie McCreevy, European Commissioner, but also the place that our second, another European Commissioner who shall remain nameless but had to resign from over COVID, also spent hard for 2 years. So in that little stretch of ground is where the battle took place, Cochwin Crinoige, and Herod the Wake didn't fight in it, but his colleagues did, and the standard that he carried for Diarmaid MacMénamoe was carried in that battle. So picking Hereward the Wake as your surname brings us back to a tremendous local connection, and you cannot read the book without thinking of Celbridge in the 18th century, because the little village where our chief protagonist, Erasmus Gray, the journalist, journalists aren't heard of, by the way, in this country, so it's the equivalent of someone from Dublin coming into Kildare. No. He comes into this area that nobody knows what a journalist is, and there are horses are scarce and oxen have to be purloined to pull it's easy to imagine Celbridge at a time of conflict, maybe after 1798 or 1803. Lady Louisa looking down at us from somewhere, and her diaries talk about the destruction, the house burning, and the sense of dismay and disarray in a town that is being ravaged by war, and the peace that we all yearn for has been disturbed. I've already spoiled the plot by saying the man who helps to prevent the peace being disturbed was commemorated and celebrated in this terrific book. It's a triumph for James, it's a triumph for Celbridge, it's a triumph for speculative fiction out of Ireland, because the longer answer to that question, has speculative fiction any connection with Ireland, and it will be shorter than the longer answer, I promise you, is that almost everything that comes out of ancient Irish tradition was speculative fiction. We mix our fantasy, the Dan and the Formosan, we mix it with our history. We didn't know the Book of Invasions, which is 6 different invasions, 14th century manuscript, was so accurate until DNA testing showed that there were 3 distinctive conquests of Ireland by people who left no trace in the DNA of the next group. And if you look at what Joyce did, if you look at what Yeats did, if you look at what, right down to Seamus Heaney, they are drawing on this tradition of where fantasy is too strong a word for it, but the real and the imagined or the perceived become so intrinsic to each other that the story cannot be told without reference to both. And that sort of imaginative richness and the long, emotionally poignant narrative that you get out of this book and out of speculative fiction in general is really central to how storytelling was invented in Ireland and pursued in Ireland and drawn on by our greatest writers. And it's lovely to come back into the heart of a suitably historic location and venue tonight, and to hear James read and talk about his book. I commend the book, consider the book launched. I don't know if it's done with bottles of champagne or whatever, or maybe another glass of wine from Ola and Carmel over here. And I'm now passing over to the main event of the evening. James.